Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special Highways UK PA Consulting web conference. And we've got an excellent panel this afternoon, and we're going to pick up something that I think is on a lot of people's minds at the moment as we've come through these extraordinary times. And it's about the huge challenges that we're all facing in all parts of the transport sector in basically trying to plot the way ahead. Have our travel patterns changed? Have our travel preferences changed as a result of a year more or less permanently in lockdown, but also with the new constraints of social distancing? Many of us have been having conversations about the changes that have been going on, the reallocation of road space, and all the other associated things that we need to think about, but quite often within a rather narrow perspective of people who are already deeply engaged in the motoring, roads, or just travel worlds. And that's why I'm particularly pleased today that we've got people who straddle those worlds, who look beyond transport and whose professional role goes beyond simply thinking about how we cope with roads, traffic, and whether the morning rush hour is going to go back. So I'm delighted that I'm able to introduce Bridget Roswell from the National Infrastructure Commission and many other positions. Laura Schoaf from Transport for the West Midlands, who I've worked with for a long time now. David Oliver, globe-trotting consultant from PA Consulting, and his colleague Anne Zhang, who's here representing the young professionals and hopefully giving us a perspective on how do they feel about things in a world which, let's face it, they're going to be living in rather than perhaps, well, people more like me. So that's the panel we've got. We're going to go in that order. We're going to hear a short opening position from each of our panelists about how they think that they've been engaging with the difficult issues of decision making in a very uncertain time. And we're going to start off with Bridget from her perspective as an advisor to government at the National Infrastructure Commission. So Bridget, very pleased to have you here. What do you think about all this?
Thanks very much, Steve. And I thought I'd sort of try and think about this by asking the question, what do I think the transport system might look like in, say, 10 or 20 years' time? And after all, 20, 30 years' time is the time frame that we try and look at for the National Infrastructure Commission. In 30 years' time, of course, everything is going to be quite different. Go back 30 years and you think, would I have expected the revival of public transport and the railways to look quite as strong as actually it did up until this most recent year? So in 30 years' time, it could be, of course, extremely different. But I suppose, therefore, one way of thinking about that is to think, are people going to want to travel? And my answer to this question is yes. I think one of the things that the pandemic has in fact taught us is that it's all very well to work from home, but actually we all also want to get out and we want to see people, friends, family, workmates, everything like that. I've got so many colleagues now champing at the bit to get back into what was the previous normal life. So that's one thing. Secondly, do I think that the means of travel will have changed in 30 years? And the answer to that is yes, except I'm not quite sure how. I think, however, that personal travel, in other words, the desire to have a personal mode of transport outside your home into which you can climb and which will deliver you at the other end, if that is possible, people will want it. And people will want to go further than they can bicycle. Bikes are all very well. I've been a cyclist for, well, all my life, I guess, on and off, slightly more off than on. I've got an electric bike now, but nonetheless, in the wet or when I've got heavy shopping, no. As I get older, and I am getting older, believe me, look at this, no. Does my mother get on a bicycle anymore? Absolutely not. So we need flexible ways of thinking about this. Active travel can be very useful, but it's not the only answer. So will we still have cars is, I guess, the kind of therefore $64,000 question here. And my answer to this question is yes. Will they be petrol fueled? No. They will be battery or hydrogen, or there will be all sorts of things going on by then. And indeed, deliveries will obviously be also using non-fossil fuel sources. But I think that everything will look very different, but lots of it will actually remain the same, because I don't think you can walk back from people's desire to visit, people's desire to travel, and people's desire to have personal modes of transport. So that may mean a lack of imagination on my part, but I cannot see that people won't want to have some kind of vehicle. I think that they will continue to want public transport to go into heavily dense places because it's so much more easy and so much more efficient. And I think we will continue to have cities. So public transport will also become more dense for those city and the commuting journeys, but cars are going to remain, and we won't be petrol heads, but we'll be battery heads instead. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. And before I go on to Laura and think more about the particular city perspective, I want to come back to you just briefly on that question of the commuter trip as opposed to the other sorts of trips that we might choose to make in our own private transport. You said you can see public transport, mass transit coming back strongly, but certainly in my own team at the RSE Foundation, I found a marked disinclination to come back into the office. Now, that could just be because people are that keen to come and sit in a room with me, but I'm hearing it from other businesses too. Are we really going to see the morning peak and the rush hour coming back in the way that we were perhaps used to 14 or 15 months ago?
Okay, so if am I going to be willing to be cheek by jowl or armpit to armpit in a crowded train and an underground train, then that is the bit that people will want to try and avoid. So there's probably going to be a bit more staggering, but on the other hand, people will then discover when they want to be in the office, they want everybody else to be in the office as well. So yes, there is going to be, and a lot will depend on the kind of job that you do. If you're the kind of person who has a relationship with their computer and is essentially a researcher, then it may well be that you will find that you can do a lot of what you do at home, and probably there will be more days spent at home and all of that. But that's not new after all. That was happening. That's just been intensified by the pandemic. That's not new. Do people want uncomfortable commutes? No, of course they don't. Do they want to commute if it's not uncomfortable? I think that's very different.
Fair point. Okay, well, look, that's the ideal handover to come to Laura now. And the view from the West Midlands, huge conurbation, huge pressure on the road and the rail networks, particularly in what we thought of as the traditional morning and evening peaks. Also, a big air quality challenge that I know you're wrestling with. But you're also wrestling with all of that from Transport for the West Midlands, just a few feet away from Andy Street, who's really the guy who we look to have a vision for what the West Midlands is going to be like. So how's it been for you guys? How do you fit together with the Mayor's ambition for the West Midlands? And what's your sense of what are the difficult decisions and how are you getting to them? Laura, what's it like in the West Midlands?
Well, it's been a really challenging year for sure. So, one of the worst bits of my career has ever been to issue a piece of advice that suggests that people shouldn't travel on public transport. That was probably a professional low for me in a pandemic year. Not a piece of advice I ever thought I would be giving. I learned that it's really easy to take your network apart. It's really not so easy then to try to put it back together. But I think I've also realized just how much our network is not integrated properly. So I love Bridget's question. I was thinking about what will that mix look like in the future. And I agree that individual transport will make up part of that mix. I just hope it's not too much of that mix. But actually, how do we get to a place where we get the most out of the capacity that we have? So as you said, traditionally, there's a morning peak, there's an afternoon peak. You can't get a seat on a train in either of those, but you could lie down in the carriageway at 9:15. There's nobody else on your train. So we're not running an efficient network for one. And in most places outside of London, we're not running a really properly integrated network as well. So, people want to know where they're going to start their journey and when they're going to end their journey. How many times do they have to change? Are they going to have to pay more than once? Why can't it just be simple? How can they book straight through if some of that journey requires a taxi and some of that journey requires an e-scooter? Fine, but can I just do it all with this one thing? And can I be sure, more importantly, that if I start my journey now and it says I'm getting to where I want to go by that point, am I going to get there at that point in time? If I am certain that I am, that I can take that journey. So I hope what we see, and I think the big opportunity, sort of post-pandemic, is actually we've never probably had a better opportunity to rebuild our networks in the image that we want to see them going forward. We've got a bus strategy now that's got a really sort of radically different approach to how, areas that have not had before can change the way their bus market operates. But more importantly, we can stop our modes necessarily competing with each other and actually provide what people want from place to place. I think one of the things that I've also been really proud of our industry and is that it's been really clear that transport is a social good. It's part of the fabric of what was needed. It's what took urgent workers where they needed to be when they didn't have access to a private car. It's critical social infrastructure, and it's seen as such, and critically it needs to be funded as such, because we need, as we come through this, to build our systems back smarter and better. Maximize not just the capacity on vehicles, but roads. How do we make our roads as smart as they can possibly be? So when you approach a smart junction, because the lights change and you think, oh, that's quite clever. I only just pulled up and now I can just sail straight through. But actually we can make all of our roads smarter, and we really should. And that's good for air quality as well. When it comes to how do we deliver a big vision for our region, we've got a mayor who leads a combined authority that's had a massive investment in rail, and we've seen a massive investment in bus, we've seen a massive investment in road. But we're a growing region with indigenous population growth, and there are not a lot of places to go. I come from a country where 6 lanes in either direction is just not unheard of. Whereas I've now lived someplace where I'm convinced I'm on a one-way road, and it turns out it's 2-way. You just have to pull in the hedge if something comes towards you. But there's not a lot of space here to play with. So we actually have to be much more clever about how we get the most out of the space that we have. And I think it's hard in the middle of a crisis to pick your head up and try to look forward, but actually that's where the real opportunity is post this pandemic. And I think hopefully we'll be able as a country to make the most of it, and to challenge some norms that previously maybe seemed too big to tackle. But when all bets are off, those things suddenly come back into play.
But Laura, one of the big challenges that we know that you face in the West Midlands, certainly in Birmingham, one of the other things that perhaps has been accelerated by everything that's happened in the last 12 months has been something of an earthquake in the world of retail. And you've seen a couple of really big and very important retail anchor stores in the centre of Birmingham, the owners saying they're not going to be coming back, they're going to cease trading. Where do you think that takes us? I asked Bridget about commuting. Let me ask you then about the city centre. The hub of the city centre used to be retail, people going shopping. Is that going to come back, or are we going to see the bullring converted to one-bed flats, perhaps?
I think, again, a bit like commuting, it was changing before this. It's just that's just been accelerated, and now it's been sort of forced into clear focus because some of these big announcements and some of the places that are beloved. People speak of high streets, as places that are beloved, and they've changed. But you can also see that there are other reasons, and I'm with Bridget. I don't think we've seen the last of cities. Cities have survived wars and plagues and all sorts of things. People like to be together. They like to socialize. And there are a whole host of other functions that they play, whether they're cultural, whether they're about eating or drinking or socializing or using parks or space differently, or just the integration between person and place is changing. There's been such a focus on how do we make more communal spaces for people, so that we change the nature of where and how we live into some place that reflects more what society wants to do with it. So, I think we can have different types of shopping and retail offer, but I do think there's definitely been a trend and a trend towards a change from people wanting to go to those big stores that may be similar to each other and they want to shop differently. I do hope for a resurgence of sort of independent shops, and you're starting to see that, or certainly I think we're starting to see that in different parts of the country with a different offer, something you can only get there. But equally, if we continue, you vote with your feet, right? So if you buy everything from Amazon and then have everything delivered from a big store, and then you wonder what's happened to your bookstore and your butcher, we have to think about how we drive our own outcomes. And I do think that people are starting to think differently about their behaviors. We've seen through some of the work that we've done, asking people what they've thought of the pandemic, that there were certain things that people liked, right? They liked quieter streets. They liked feeling safer out in different ways. They liked quieter skies. That was a big thing, and being able to hear and walk and do things slightly differently. So if we don't forget those things that we have enjoyed as much as one can enjoy being in the situation we've been in the past year, then we need to think about what decisions we make as individuals to make sure that those things are still there when we want them.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, look, we must move on. I'm going to bring David in now. David, you obviously span all the transport sectors. You spend as much time on rail as on other factors, but also working across the world. How is the uncertainty playing out in the different modes, perhaps? It must be hugely uncertain in rail, where in this country the trains are only running at all because of massive central government handouts. So the trains can trundle past the house where I live with practically no one on them. Surely this isn't sustainable.
And it's really interesting that you pick on that, Steve, because I think the thing we've seen is actually the infrastructure spend and the execution of the projects and the big mega programs has just carried on, and actually, even when you look at airport builds, which have been the most vulnerable really to the fall away in cash, they've started to restart. So those master planning scheme builds have started to kick back in across the globe. And actually, high-speed rail is continuing to accelerate. But you cut to the crux of it, I think, with the customer habits and what's actually going on, because we're busy building the infrastructure, but our customer habits have fundamentally changed. And I think we're making a bet now, and we're making the strategic choices as to how much they've changed and how much people will come back in what form. So you look at, UK rail, we're in special circumstances. That's true across Europe too. The Amsterdam metro has been decimated. The passenger numbers are, I think, a 20th. The aviation industry has gone much, much deeper than the 9/11, and with the announcements over the weekend, it's going to hit cash flow again. So you're then looking at another 2 years to rebuild the cash reserves that the aviation industry had. And I think the challenge the industry as a whole is facing is that we've been forced to respond tactically. And necessarily, we're looking at things like the 3-day season ticket to get people back in. One of the flag carriers is on its 5th organisational restructure and cost-cutting exercise of the pandemic. So it's been brutal and it's been quite tactical. And I think what we haven't got our head around yet for the planning is actually the digital technology adoption that we've, as a citizenship or as a population across the world, had to adopt, what that really means for the long-term travel patterns and what it really means for our technology roadmaps. And also what the taxpayer will be willing to tolerate given the pretty perilous state the economy is now in across the globe. And I think it's the customer lens that for me we need to really think about, and we need to think about the widest possible customer lens. And I think that might drive us away from the big mega projects. So I think we might be initiating the last mega projects of the generation. Because actually, as we reassess our customer segmentation, and it's been great that the industry has been focused on customer, but we've been quite focused on our own customer, and we've been quite focused in the rail industry on the rail customer, the road industry on the road customer, and actually to that flexible and end-to-end view, I think we haven't quite got it right, and I think it's got some fundamental challenges for what we build. And I think this is the bit that's possible. So if I go back to my pre-transport days, I used to do drug strategy, and you look then at the end-to-end things. So you look at childhood education, you look at enforcement, you look at treatment, you look at upstream interdiction. So I think for us that balance of place, travelling customer, non-travelling taxpayer, we need to think about the cities and the environments we're getting set up for them, the balance across the different routes and modes. So I think overall, we sort of need to move to a strategy that's a bit more like we forced ourselves to be like across the pandemic. So planning and building major infrastructure in a way that we put greater emphasis on modularity, on incremental time to value, and actually delivering for the citizen faster, rather than, dare I say it, tunnels between Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I think we need to, I'm very much with Laura, the integration and the cross-boundary thinking. We really need to challenge ourselves about whether we've done enough and how we go further. And I think the other big theme for me is around the digital. So how do we bake in both the digital option from the individual, like they might stay at home, they might enjoy the quiet and the clouds and the skies, but also the digital interfaces and the way that we modernise and transform the actual transport infrastructure and the system itself.
So if I were being a provocative person, and surely that would never be an accusation levelled at me, but I might deduce from what you were saying there, David, that what we should really do is scrap the later phases of High Speed 2 and spend the money on some useful technology junction upgrades across the West Midlands, so that we can get the most out of the roads in relatively low cost, relatively fast moving schemes, move away from these great big transformational changes that are only going to affect the people who want to make the particular trips in those places. Perhaps spread the money around a bit more. Is that what you're saying?
So I think what I'm saying is, as we look at those schemes, and I think high-speed rail's a good example, do we need to do it in a way that delivers that big monolithic value, or can we start to get some of the value and some of the improvements out faster, Steve? So I think, I think to your, High Speed 2 is another question for possibly another day, but the balance of what goes into the north versus the Midlands versus what connects London, and how quickly the people in those areas are seeing the benefits, and how important it is for those areas and for the regeneration post-COVID for each of them. And I think there's probably some testing of those assumptions that could be done.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Let's move on to Anne. Now, Anne, as an early stage in your career, I think it's fair to say you'll be seeing all of this. You won't be hidebound by years of arguing over the value of time and time savings like some of the rest of us. I totted up recently, probably something in the region of a decade arguing about nothing but. So coming to this with a fresh pair of eyes, does it all look frighteningly uncertain to you, or are you just seeing the world always keeps changing, our demands keep changing, our lifestyles change, new inventions come along, the pressures that you and other professionals are trying to address change? It's just business as usual, really, or is it an unusual and a particularly difficult time? What do you think?
Thanks, Steve. So actually, my gut feel is that it's the latter. And the reason I say this is, of course, COVID and the pandemic has fundamentally challenged the assumptions that many of us plan transport on. But that's not a pandemic specific factor, right? If you look at some of the research that's been done, even pre-pandemics in 2019, there was research that showed that, with an increase in commuting times, women are disproportionately more likely to drop out of the workforce than men. And, actually, have we been planning transport capacity to account for that? Have we been thinking about how transport can enable a step change in getting women back into the workforce? Probably not. It's probably not something that we've considered in our normal planning assumptions. So is COVID just another instance of these planning assumptions that have gone unnoticed, and it's been forced, in some ways into our mind's eye? And I think that, part of the problem is that the infrastructure cycle is so long. I mean, I'm sure nobody here is a stranger to the crazy of project overruns, and it means that today we're already building for future generations. That's just a fact. And then there's a question of, name me one successful business out there that assumes what its customers want, rather than actually asking them. If a commercial business like Coca-Cola or Amazon went about their day-to-day business like that, they would go out of business pretty fast. And the question is, how do we actually extend that thinking into the transport space? And maybe will that help us to manage that future uncertainty better? Because we're starting to see where the direction of thinking is going. And it's a real win-win, actually, for current and future generations. So seizing on Bridget's comment about the EV transition, some of the engagement that the NIC YPP has been doing is thinking about, well, how will that affect young people? And what we're actually hearing is that a lot of young people are telling us they're likely to buy their cars secondhand due to costs. You know, the average cost of a new car buyer is what, 54, I think, in the UK. And so they're worried that in the future, this means that some young people are going to be forced to choose between buying a secondhand petrol car or diesel car and the potential social stigma that comes with that in a net zero world, versus alternatively being cut off from society because of poor public transport links. And so if we really want a green transport policy to be successful and to account for those changes in sort of social perspectives, we really need to be doing a better job of engaging the people that will actually use those systems. So I guess this then brings me to this question of, young people can't do it alone. We can't, alone we can't influence the scenarios that are being used for transport planning. And so then it really comes down to sort of allyship, and baking into that thinking is BAU for transport planning. And during my time on the NIC panel and the people that I've spoken to, I've been sort of consistently impressed with how much drive and insight are being generated among younger people. There's no shortage of great thinking. And so the real question is, how do you get those voices into mainstream decision making to better provide certainty for the future? And so I think there's a challenge there for the people that currently hold power to be an ally to the youth voice. The NIC 5PP is a great example. It offers us an opportunity to go out and speak to young people and then almost directly plug that into the commissioner's thinking on recommendations for the future. But to bring that thinking into BAU, I think that ultimately that will help to generate much more certainty on what people want out of their transport networks and how those transport networks can help to generate a better future.
So I've got two questions for you, Anne, in the light of what you were just saying there, because when we were thinking about setting up this event, and when we've been, Charlie and David and I have been involved in this conversation on and off for a while now, we've been thinking not just how do we bring younger voices in, or a more diverse range of people's opinions to the table. We've also been fretting, are we looking at the narrow issues of transport, allowing ourselves to forget from time to time that transport's a derived demand. Generally speaking, nobody goes out because they want to park somewhere. They want to park and go somewhere or be somewhere. So there's two challenges, aren't there? Looking beyond the transport boundary, but also bringing in a greater diversity of opinion. Beyond the NIC experience you've had, have you got any suggestions for us, for those of us who perhaps are considered, rightly or wrongly, to be part of the business as usual world you describe? What is it we should be doing differently to get those voices to the table?
So I think that part of the momentum towards doing that is to really lean into this concept of outcomes-based planning. Because like you said, ultimately, no one is getting into their car for the sake of getting into their car, except potentially if you have a young child who falls asleep because you drive them around. But ultimately, while we traveling, it's because of the outcomes that can be delivered by going the extra mile. So is it that we want to be accessing healthcare services? Is it that we want to be able to access town squares so we can meet people, we can socialize, we can generate those connections that humans thrive on? Is it the case that we rely on transport to reap the gains of agglomeration in cities and access those higher paying jobs? And I think then it comes, once you do that outcomes-based thinking, it naturally leads you to think we need to break out of our silos, because those outcomes can be delivered through a host of different interventions, right? So we're thinking about the digital impact that COVID's highlighted. If we are moving to more telecommuting, is it the case that the emphasis on transport might be slightly less on commuter travel and more on how does transport allow access to social amenities? And then once you have that conversation, then you start to move to a more holistic planning approach that naturally draws in more diverse voices.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to come to Bridget in a second, because what I'm interested in is, Bridget, the NIC has had a pat on the back there from Anne about her involvement, which is always nice to have, so put a tick in the box for that. But of course, you look not just at transport, but at national infrastructure generally, and I'd be interested in hearing how has the NIC been able to bring in that diversity of views in the other sectors. But while you're having a think about that, Laura, question that's come in on the chat here, has been saying, we've been talking about better integration for decades now. I certainly remember, I remember the day after the 1997 election, the Deputy Prime Minister saying little but integrated national transport strategy. partly because he was extremely tired, because he didn't say much else at all that day. But we've been bashing away at this for ages. A 2-point question for you. It's great to talk about it. How do we do it? And do we need different institutions to do it? Do we need to move away from what's often criticised as being an overly Whitehall-led and London-centric world?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the answer is yes.
That was nice and short. Thank you.
Yeah. So I always say, but the answers go together, don't they? So what needs to change? Why could we potentially be doing it now when we've been talking about it and haven't been able to do it? I think a really big part of that is about data, and genuinely understanding data. So I think moving transport authorities into being data-driven bodies is really important. So we now have a better understanding of exactly who moves from where, when, and why than we ever had. And we're also using data to try to change the way we engage with people. So on some of Anne's points as well, you know, I think historically the way we talk to people is very outdated, actually. Young people, so they tell me, I'm not one of them either, they can have conversations in a whole host of different forums. So how do we build a digital platform that allows both for better engagement, but then through that tells us what we need to know about the integration that we might not have known before? And there is no way that somebody sitting in London can tell me that they understand how to better integrate their network than the people who live and work and take these networks in any major city up and down this country. So the answer is it's got to be done at a regional level. It's got to be devolved to regions in a meaningful way for them to enact it, and it's got to be data driven. And it's much easier to be modally agnostic when you're working with data than it is to be when you're trying to bring modal silos together and ask them to share. I think that's what's changed and what will enable us to do it differently now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Bridget, you had a moment to think about that. You think about power networks, all the things that the National Infrastructure Commission has to think about. What are the lessons from the other aspects of infrastructure that might give us some pointers on how we can create a broader and more diverse and more inclusive conversation when it comes to transport?
So I think there are several. One is around what we've called deliberation. So one of the things that we've done in some of the other, actually more the placemaking side of this, so it's transport, we try to cut across. So transport goes with energy, goes with where your places are, managing flood, all of these things. Yeah, we need to cut across the different aspects and to get people together to talk about that. So, and that's the way that you can create diverse voices, is actually by being able to listen to them. The YPP, which was, you know, tribute to Sadie Morgan, who pushed for, and I was very much in support of it. That is one way of getting a particular form of a diverse voice, and hopefully it helps us bring some of those ideas in. But actually going out to places and talking to people is really the only way. And the data is really important, but it's not, a bit like infrastructure, it's necessary, but it is not sufficient, because we're talking about what the future is going to be like, and the only thing I do know is that the past is an imperfect guide to the future. It may tell you some things are impossible. The infrastructure, so a lot of the infrastructure we've got out there is already a couple of hundred or even longer. Some of our roads, I live near the A1, that road, bits of it at any rate, go back, you know, millennia. So, and our settlements are related to where that infrastructure is. So there isn't a huge, if you like, burden or opportunity of history, but the future is going to be different. So if you rely upon just knowing more and more about now in order to know what will happen, you will make a really big mistake. So the other part of that, there's two bits. One is devolution, because that allows local solutions, and I'm absolutely with Laura on that. You cannot do this stuff sitting in a department in Whitehall, and after all, that's, I imagine, why you left, Steve. So we need more people around the place doing different things, and the other bit of that that goes with it is experiment. Not everything is going to work. The future is different. We have to try various things, we have to experiment with various things, and we have to be able to fail fast. And it's much easier to do that if you haven't got a central scheme running out of Whitehall. So more local decision making, more talking to people, more experiment, more fail fast.
But before I leave you on that point, Bridget, one of the things that struck me many times over the years is that I can experiment on some things, but when it comes to experimenting, particularly with transport infrastructure, once you've knocked a row of houses down to put a road in, or a tramway, or a high-speed railway, they're gone. You've got to be pretty damn sure that you want them knocked down. There's no such thing as an experimental bypass. So is it really credible that we can do that, take that experimental approach, as you say, get in, fail fast if you're going to fail, recognize that a certain proportion of the things you do aren't going to work, and then you need to do something different? Because that fits very uncomfortably with the political reality, which, as we all know, ministers and elected councillors don't make mistakes, because if they did, they wouldn't get re-elected.
It is very much more difficult, that's true, that these things are very visible and have visible consequences. And once you've pulled the house down, it's true that it's gone. On the other hand, if you do things on a smaller scale to start with, you will have smaller consequences. The really big problems are the very, very big schemes, which might come back to. So on the HS2 front, for example, I've been in favour for a long time, and we put into our rail needs assessment, start on some of the things where it's most obvious that there is a lack, like Birmingham to the East Midlands, for example. Let's make sure we really prioritise that part of it while we're still working on other parts of it, rather than thinking of the whole thing as has to be delivered all in one piece. There will be mistakes and there will be consequences, but you'll make smaller ones.
Okay, thank you. Okay, before I come back over to Anne and David then, Laura, you want to jump in on this one?
Sorry, I don't know how I'm raising my hand like the Luddite that I am trying to talk about data. Can I just give a really good example of that, which is the e-scooter trial, which has been able to be rolled out during the pandemic, and being able to take sort of a suspension to a legislative framework to try something. And while it's true that definitely not everyone is allowed to fail, officers can fail and should be proud of trying things and failing. And for example, we tried a mobility as a service pilot probably 16 months ago now. And we were really clear that we had no idea if it was going to take, if it was going to be too early, if it wasn't going to take, but all we wanted to do is make sure we learned from it. And actually we did learn from it, and it might resurrect again, but it hasn't done what we thought it would do. That's okay. So as long as you can then adjust, as Bridget said, and go forward, that's okay. So I do think we've got some good examples of where we've been able to trial different things. Some are successful, some are not.
Thanks, Laura. Anne, I did see your hand go up there. Anne.
Yes. I think Laura's point is great, and I think the most important part of that is to learn from it. I think that's probably some where the industry might be lacking a little bit, is we do all of these ex ante assessments of what benefits do we think these pilot schemes or these big transport schemes are going to generate, but how often do we actually look back 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line and say, did those benefits emerge? Because if not, then we're just planning based on our existing assumptions. We're not planning based on what we've seen actually happen.
The difficulty, of course, that any of those have actually ever tried to undertake, so much else has changed that isolating the bit that you're really interested in. So with the other, and so the learning from that is that we have to do much more sort of broad brush, sort of scaled assessments, rather than trying to really pin down, it was this bit. We need to be much more it's kinder to ourselves almost in doing those post assessments, and then we might actually get somewhere with them.
Yeah, perfection should not be the enemy of good.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely right. Yes.
Well, I suppose, thank everyone and draw everything to a close there, but we have got some more time and we've got some more questions. I've long learnt that cost-benefit analysis is a very good way of choosing between options and a very poor way of defending why you're doing something in the first place. Something I tried and completely failed to explain to the Public Accounts Committee in my time. I'm going to come to David and Anne. Actually, I'm going to come to Anne and David in that order, because we all know there's nothing a consultant likes more than a bit of modelling. Right, nice bit of trend analysis, nice bit of modeling, and I'm going to run a couple of questions together that we've had in the chat here. So on the one hand, should we be doing more trend analysis? Should we be doing more modeling, trying to think in ever more detail about the future? But in that context, how far should we be modeling what we think the pressures for transport would be and how we respond to them? And how far should we be saying, not we're going to give you the system you want, we're going to give you the system you need, which is of course different. So Anne, how do you feel about that? And how do you feel about it? And how do your clients feel about it?
Yeah, so of course, as both an economist and a consultant, there's really nothing I enjoy more on the weekend than a bit of, Excel, a bit of Python, a bit of R. But putting that aside, I think the problem that currently faces us with modeling is not, is modeling a helpful tool or not? It is a helpful tool. It helps us to plan on scenarios. But the question is, what are we modeling? And I think that, part of the Green Book refresh last year said that there's been a divergence between, the stuff that goes into a benefit cost ratio and a cost benefit analysis and the strategic motivation for why we're investing in these transport systems to begin with. And I've seen over and over again, these business cases for these huge transport investments, they look a lot at the time saved on commuters and the impact that has on productivity. They look a lot at what could be the pound financial value. What they try and model, they model less because it's more difficult, is the impact on these wider outcomes. So access to amenities, and the cost of reduced air quality, the cost of carbon emissions. And if we are able to move to modeling those, and there are established approaches for doing that already, actually then you start to realign the modeling with why we're building these things to begin with. And so in my head, there's a bit of a question of how do we disseminate the great thinking that already exists within academia, within policy, on how to capture those more strategic benefits and costs on a day-to-day basis.
But then if we capture them, and I'm just thinking of daily life in Laura's office here. So you've modeled your air quality challenge and you realize we're gonna have to have less traffic. Sounds easy, really, really isn't. So then you're into what are the projects, what are the interventions that are gonna get us a thriving economy, happy voters, and less traffic. Is that something that, does modeling really help us with that? I guess it helps with the scaling the fundamental problem, and it could help with identifying some of the solutions, but does it really help with the political pressure to come up with something that both persuades people that changes in their lives are necessary and worthwhile, and if they make them, they're going to be happier and healthier as a result?
Yeah, I mean, modeling always is garbage in, garbage out, right? So ultimately you need to get out on the streets and engage. You need to understand what are the barriers facing people on making those changes today. And there's so much research out there on behavioral biases, why we say things that we will do things and we don't down the line. Going out and actually engaging with people, that's what makes policy successful. It's not sitting behind a computer and doing some high-tech modeling.
But it's also doing strategic modelling so that you can explain what the model is actually doing and not just create some enormous black box, which is what has been happening, particularly in transport analysis and the whole web tag thing. A huge black box, nobody understands it, and therefore they ignore it. If you can produce a modelling strategy, which people actually say, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Yes, your conclusion, yeah, I can see how you got there. Then you've got a much better chance of getting the right engagement, which Anne is talking about.
I get that. So David, it turns out you and I are the only people on the call who really understand WebTag. I'm guessing you probably take it to bed to read most evenings, but in the world that you're living in and the advice that you're giving, how important is the modeling, the trend analysis, the thinking through, this is what was happening, and if we return to the previous trend path, this is what it's going to look like, as opposed to posing the question, what is it you wanted to achieve here? And then we can start talking about how to achieve it. Where do you see the balance in those things?
Unfortunately, I'm a biological scientist, Steve, rather than an engineer. So I'd say no more trend analysis. We probably do enough, actually. And I'd say we probably look too far into the future with too great a certainty when we do it as well, I'm afraid. So, and then I guess to your last bit, should we tell people we're giving them the system they need rather than the system they want? We've been doing that for years. So I think we actually need to look at the paradigm again. I think Anne's point about getting out and observing what's really happening, actually challenging the way that customers, taxpayers are behaving and interacting with transport and understanding it, is actually that observational science coupled with the amount of modelling, maybe scaled back a little, that we already do, I think gives you a better sort of launch pad. I think the second thing probably builds on some of the earlier points on governance. I think there's a need for a brave enough set of changes that it's okay to fail and fail fast, but also that it releases enough of the money. And I think the sort of the devolution bit often misses the actually that means control of cash has to change and it has to alter. I think police and crime commissioners is my big parallel that actually broke a very, very centralised controlling system and threw it out to the regions. And that direct electoral accountability, coupled with the funding for the forces and the ability to direct political priorities without operational detail, actually starts to change the way it translates. So I think what you then get to, Steve, is a bunch of people controlling the money who are empowered to try and do some things differently to give people what they really want because they've been elected on a platform that says they will do.
And is that the mayors that we've got? Is that Andy Street, or is that creation of 34 new transport commissioners?
So I'd be, and I'll then defer to Laura, but I'd be really keen that we don't create new things where we have people who could do it already, and that we allow the sort of, you know, do work for Transport for the North. There are a bunch of people who have been politically elected who care very deeply about the transport infrastructure and how it supports the people in their regions. I think the bit that we haven't then followed through with is actually breaking the funding links and releasing the cash in a way that actually we let the trust go as well as the cash, and then we follow it through.
Okay, I'm going to come to Bridget next because I saw you nodding there, but I just want to observe at last a question has appeared in the chat that is definitely answerable, which is where can people access the recording of this conversation later this week? And by reading that out, I'm hoping that somebody's going to put into our closed chat what the answer to it is, and then I'll read it out. Bridget.
So I spent 10 years as chief economist for the Greater London Authority from the 2002 when we really began to get going, and just come back to this, what's the governance model? Having a transport authority with control of some cash, plus the mayor as chair of that transport authority, enabled us to bring the whole thing together as to how you were thinking about where development might take place, opportunity areas, working with boroughs, and the transport system that you needed to support it. So Steve pointed out earlier, transport we go somewhere to do something. So you have to link these things together, and having that devolved authority and the devolved power in the Transport for London is the way to bring those two things together. But London is the only place where we've managed to make it happen, I think, really properly as yet. And it is partly funding. It is partly that, the thing about Transport for London, after all, is that there was a big pot of money called tube fares. And that enabled you to do some leverage when we were financing Crossrail, go out and use that money to leverage the ability to borrow in a way which other authorities find much more difficult because they do not have control over large pots of public transport money. So,
okay. Yeah, I get that. I think we're going to come back just before we end. I want to come back to all of you on whether the answer, certainly to the question of broadening the debate and having a more inclusive debate, is about the governance model, the cash, the accountability, and getting out and about. And I have a particular question on that, but I'm absolutely delighted to say that I've spotted in the chat, we've actually got Bruce Dickinson, formerly of Iron Maiden, who has asked a question about the risk to social equality, or rather social inequality in transport being exacerbated as we come out of lockdown, as we come out of the pandemic. We hear a lot of fine words about kickstarting mass transit, public transport, and all those good things. I don't want to get on a train anytime soon. Does anyone else want to get on a train anytime soon? Is this a real thing? And are we going to embed some of our social problems, our social inequality, rather than managing to vault past them? Bridget.
Well, I'm certainly willing to get on a train. In fact, I have got on trains. when I've really needed to go somewhere that I could not do, to do something which I could not have done otherwise. So, and the train was perfectly okay. So, but I think the inequality point is nonetheless incredibly important. It's a bit like your ability to hear from diverse voices. And I think too often all these decisions are being made by people who find it easy to work from home, people who have comfortable places to work when they are at home, and not really thinking about all those people who either can't work from home, or if they do need to, actually just don't have the space or the resource to do it effectively. And I think that is the point at which it's that sort of digital divide almost. School kids who've been so-called doing homeschooling, but actually haven't had any kit to do it with because their parents couldn't afford any and neither could their schools. So I think that there is a huge risk of an emerging divide, inequality divide, and in particular, actually, it's not the young professionals, it's the generation below, the generation who are in school and leaving school, who run the risk of being seriously deprived coming out.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, Laura.
So, I've got a lot to say on this issue. So I think that there are two really important things here. So one of which is that we've just come through something where, and this is somebody else's phrase, not mine, but it's quite good, which is that we've all been through the same storm, but we have not all been in the same boat. So this pandemic has had disproportional impacts on groups of people, and particularly on people who are frontline workers and some of our least well paid. If we come out of this pandemic in a way in which we are making cuts to our public transport system because we cannot afford it, because either we've had a loss of revenue, and or because it's not deemed to be as socially necessary as most of us on this call know that it is, that network will constrain. Now, in the West Midlands, there are probably 30% of our population that do not have access to a car or vehicle. They rely entirely on the public transport network to get them around and to where they need to be. So if we come out of this pandemic in a way that sees those markets decimated and those connections lost between either people and health or education or jobs or whatever, we're going to disproportionately impact the same exact groups of people that have been hardest hit by this pandemic, and that should just absolutely not be allowed to happen. So, the transport networks are a social good. They're social infrastructure, and they're part of the fabric of communities that can't be afforded to not exist. And if on the other side of that, this is my personal view, is, and I grew up in New York City, and I'm a New Yorker by background, and one of the great things that I think happens, especially on urban transit, is that people see the whole city. So if you spend your life being chauffeur driven around in a car, you will not see and understand the place that you live. But public transport is a great place for everyone, especially the tube in London. You observe the city that you live in, and I think that's really important from a whole nother perspective that's almost got nothing to do with what we're talking about today. But it's important for people to see each other and to know who they share spaces with and communities with and what cities are all about. So I think there are two real risks in that. And I think it's about understanding its role as a public service, as opposed to thinking about it again as a good to do or a nice to have. It's an absolute essential.
Okay, I just want to, before I go over and ask Anne and David this one, I just want to press one thing there with you, Laura, which is, of course, London, for various reasons, we always have to say London, well, London is different, but the intensity of the public transport offer right across a large area of London is quite different to most of our other cities. So as someone who used to hop on the tube myself back in the before, yes, you do see more people there, but does that really equate in the way you're describing between, say, using the underground system across the islands that make up New York and other cities in this country? Perhaps I'm thinking Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield. I mean, is it the same?
I think it is. I think, well, I can speak for my own because I know in and around the West Midlands and Birmingham, if you jump on the tram, you will see a pretty good representation of the populations that make up the West Midlands, and not everybody who's on your tram looks and thinks like you. And I think so I think it's not this, I mean, obviously the tube system, the subway systems, those are absolutely amazing systems, but we have little microcosms of those in our other big cities. And I think whether you're on Merseyrail or the trams in Manchester or in trams in West Midlands, you see that. And of course buses, the powerhouse, does a huge amount of the more journeys than everything else, and our buses are really diverse. So I do think that does go across all modes, and we would all love to dream of all of our cities having systems as good as London, and that's actually what we're here to deliver.
Well, I certainly, whenever I've been to the West Midlands, have hopped on a bus whenever I could, and I have to say, certainly there have been a wide variety of other folks on the bus, very few of whom look quite as stylish as me, and you can read into that judgment of my style if you will, but I did buy this in Peter Jones. Anne, what's your chop on this?
Yes, I completely agree that innovation and the innovations that come out of this pandemic, they will increase the size of the pie, but they don't tell you how that pie is sliced. And there's a real risk that innovation could accelerate inequality rather than being used as a tool to bridge that gap. And I wonder again whether some of this problem is this question: inequality is not commerciable. It's not commercially sensible to focus on solutions that specifically support reducing inequality. And I think we can really challenge that thinking. And again, it requires breaking away from this siloed thinking. So one example that we've been looking at, for example, is your access to transport link. It dictates the jobs that you can access. Equally, if you're in a lower socioeconomic group, you're more likely to be dependent on public transport due to housing costs. So you're more likely to live away from centres where well-paying jobs are. At the same time, unemployment is the factor that most impacts fuel poverty. If you're in fuel poverty, you increase the risk of having a respiratory illness. Not only does this drive health inequality, it also puts pressure on the NHS. It requires us to be investing more capital and expanding hospitals. It's driving up those costs. So making those linkages, it's really difficult to do the modeling analysis to pinpoint the exact marginal impact, but the strategic impact of how these different interventions and the commercial benefits of reducing inequality, we need to be taking that into account. And I think actually, if that enters the conversation more, suddenly it could look financially sensible to be making sure that we are continuing to invest in things like mass transport, transit networks that help to both, to really bridge that gap.
Okay, thank you. And very briefly, David, and then we'll wrap up the call. So from your perspective, I think from what everyone has said, yes, there is a risk, but what's the right way of us preempting that risk actually being realised?
I think it's to focus on the social good element. So I think if we reimagine how we see transport and how we see the transport infrastructure and do it explicitly as something that is necessary for social good and to drive down the inequalities, I think we go a long way away from when we start to do cost out of operations type decisions. We actually we correct a skew for taking money from operations and providing it into large infra and capital spend, and I think that will be a key.
Thanks, David. Okay, so the answer to the question, how do we access the recording of this chat, is that a link will be mailed out to everyone who registered for the event, probably tomorrow, possibly slightly later this week, and I suspect a version might also be posted on the Highways UK conference website. It would be great to carry on the conversation. I have a particular question I'd love to ask you, and I'm going to ask to finish off and just get your just very brief chop on it, which is the debate about low traffic neighbourhoods has been, let's just say, lively in some places. And what I've heard from people, particularly from a couple of people working in local authorities, has been it brought people to the table who otherwise just never got involved. So do we need something that, when we're talking about getting out and about, do we need something that's both engaging but perhaps provocative even, in order to get more people to really tell us what they think and what they want from their networks? So I'm going to go around my screen in reverse order. I'm going to go David, Anne, Laura, Bridget, in that order. David.
In short, yes, and I think we need to move away from the traditional platforms we use to get that input. Otherwise, even going out and with provocative questions, we self-perpetuate the answers we already get.
Okay, and different platform?
Yeah, completely agree. I would never respond to a call for evidence hosted on a website, for example. I doubt many people my age would. So different platforms are essential.
Okay, Laura?
I think conflict is excellent. You need to have it in order to get new ideas. So I absolutely think something that has a little bit of spark to it will get the best out of everybody and get people engaged that won't have been engaged. So I completely agree.
Okay, a bit of provocative spark. Bridget, what do you reckon?
I'm trying to think of why I should disagree and in order to be provocative, but I can't. But what I will say is that the provocation has to rest on the why people are traveling, the trip purpose. And in particular, I'm still very concerned about linked trips. So you want to drop the child off at school, go to the shops, get to work, do something else, come back, do all that in reverse. And we think still tremendously in terms of one trip purpose, and it's crap, particularly for women.
We have to broaden our thinking. The takeout I'm going to take from this conversation this afternoon, with a big thank you to the panel, big thank you to everyone who's logged on to hear our conversation, is in almost every respect, we need to broaden our thinking. The uncertainties that we're wrestling with are quite possibly more different because of the pandemic, but thinking on a 10 to 20 year timescale as we have to, maybe not that much different from all of the other social changes we've dealt with since the 1940s or 50s. So we need to broaden our perspective, and doing so, we need to broaden the conversation and the people and perspectives that we bring into that. That's my takeout from today. A big thank you to everyone, and we're going to wind it up there. Look out for the next of these debates from Highways UK.